Our panel today hits on the essence of academia, which is pedagogy, including specifically the facets of building curriculum, incorporating justice and general knowledge, classroom tools and approaches to break prejudice, and also researchers struggle to break stereotypes and preconstructed images. Myself, having struggled with all these levels already in my small career track as a teacher, as a researcher, and as an administrator in Lebanon and in Australia, I'm looking very much forward to hear what our speakers have to say today. We'll start ahead without any delays with our first speaker for today, Sabiha Allouj. Sabiha is a doctoral candidate at the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS, London University, working on emotional capital and the making of dissident bodies in Lebanon. She follows in that research ethnographic work in order to map the temporality and forms of different processes of coupling, which is very interesting, prior to marriage in contemporary urban Lebanon. I need to have a copy of that when you finish it. Her talk today addresses the challenges faced by researchers to break trite and prosaic approaches to research and theories. Her presentation is titled, No Longer Caught Between Two Worlds, Towards a Decolonized Feminist Research in the Middle East. The word is yours, Sabiha.
Good morning, everyone. And obviously, I'm very happy to be here, so thank you for inviting me. And many thanks to all the organizers. There's quite a lot I'm going to be saying. Okay. There's quite a lot I'm going to be commenting on. It's mostly a presentation about observation that I have noticed during my studies between the UK and Lebanon, from where I am. And I try to organize the presentation in a way that it can speak to everyone, because I'm not very much sure about everybody's background here. So, I mean, if it sounds too 101, please forgive me, but you know, like, these are the things I took into account before actually doing the presentation. So I'm going to start very quickly, go straight to the point. This paper adopts a feminist approach in order to unravel neo-Orientalist practices that accompany research in the Middle East. And in this sense, a feminist approach is not limited to gender per se. Rather, it is a methodological approach that is capable of accounting for those who have been left out of histories and those who live on the margins of societies. We usually think about women, but there are also lots of other, categories, and as I will show later. So feminist research in this presentation must be understood as both activism and academia. I'm really not sure how we can take out one, remove one from the other. And feminist research in the Middle East is often trapped between speaking to activists and to policymakers at home, in addition to speaking or talking back to Western, social scientists. So it's a very special, particular sort of position for people, be them men or women, who are conducting feminist research in the Middle East. And let me go to the, to the start, really. So in this paper, there are two things that we should remember. So one of them is the notion of violence. Like, when I'm going to speak about violence, it's not limited to the use of power or to processes of subjectification and oppression. That I'm mostly interested in epistemic violence, or knowledge as violence. That's when our knowledge of the world is strictly defined along Eurocentric or Western lines. And if we go back, this is very, very easy. It's not as complicated as it looks. So I go back to the work of the late Edward Said, and I use his, his Orientalism prism. And if we follow Edward Said Orientalism prism, basically what he says is that the West eventually constructs itself, as the superior, sophisticated, civilized, all the beautiful things you can think about, versus an East that's very inferior, weak, along with all the rest. And this sort of binary reproduction, of certain knowledges become visible in different spheres of everyday life. I'm going to pick something very, let's stop, for example, at the, STEM and A and H. So that's the sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics, I think, opposed to arts and humanities. Arts and humanities, if you look, in the column, it's in the same categories with nature, with women, with queer people, with other people, with poor people, with black, brown, and people of color, with the East, etc., etc. Now, if it wasn't for the works of feminists, thinkers and critical thinkers who have really deconstructed this binary to show the extent of a world that is strictly defined almost along Western notions, Western knowledge, which is often assumed to be universal, So, but also this binary is not really that clear. For example, if we look at the man, there's no such thing as men and women. There are hierarchies of men, there are hierarchies of women, and every context, every social context produces and informs particular hierarchies of men and women. And then the same goes, within the same category. We have class, we have the rich, we have the less privileged, and then we have aesthetics. So even among rich women, we have thin women, we have fat women. And then, of course, we have race, we have white women, black women. And if we just think about, all the aesthetics, all the things we look at on TV and what it means to look at a particular way and to behave in a particular way, and the extent, of what is assumed to be hegemonic and this obsession with consuming all things Western is particularly, problematic. And if this sounds too theoretical and stuff, I think I can move us to visuals. I love visuals because they really help. So these are paintings from the 17th century, 18th century, or, from Orientalist painting. And they are mostly, maybe Eugène Delacroix, so he's one of these people, painters who just had this fantasizing, fetishist, almost voyeuristic, idea about sexuality and women in the Middle East. And the interesting fact is that almost a century later, when photography, technology was there, taken photographs, these are the postcards that France used to send from Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia back home. And these photos are really staged. It's not how women in the Maghreb live. These are stage photos, and they don't tell us anything actually about the women in the Maghreb. If anything, they tell us that this is how the French constructed their view of women in the Maghreb, in addition to opposing these women against this binary of the Muslim angry man who is obsessed with God, and religion, etc., etc. And these postcards are all in the book, The Colonial Harem of Malik al-Lula, also the late Malik al-Lula. And actually, it was one of the most groundbreaking works in terms of critiquing the Orientalist approach towards sexuality in the Middle East. But the thing is, basically what I want to show you is that the technology might have changed. So we had paintings, we had photography, and this is the digital age, and nothing has really changed. And it's exactly the same. I mean, if anything, it's always this obsession, with the veiled woman, with the hidden body, etc., etc. And this is very problematic. I have a problem with Caracalla. I view it as something called internalized Orientalism. I really don't see the difference between Caracalla and any of these, and I wonder where he got inspired from, and there's really nothing I like about it. I like it very much from an aesthetic contemporary dance thing, but I disagree with this. And I was walking yesterday in the library, Antoine, and I saw this cover for a book, and it's a new book, and it's about this one of the very few documented women, let's say, in the history of, the Muslim civilization. And this woman is Al-Malika Asmat al-Din Khalil Shajrat al-Dur. And she was alive in the 11th century. And it's like, why do you want to go back and use, one of these Orientalist painting if you want to talk about a woman, from the 11th century? So this, my view could be viewed as too much. I am a killjoy, I do admit it. Nothing, I have to critique everything because I'm really, really concerned about how things have just been reproduced like terribly. And let's think about, sexuality per se, apart from the binary of men and women. So these are the things, these are the assumptions that we make about sexuality in the Middle East. Everything is behind closed doors. Let's kill gays. Sex is only equated, with biological reproduction. There are no lesbians in the Middle East. Of course, there are worse things. Women are never happy. Men are unsatiable. Child brides. Christians are more tolerant than Muslims, and et cetera, et cetera. And actually, when we think about it this way, there are two things really that are there mostly. First of all, like this obsession with sex as taboo. And when I did my fieldwork, yeah, clearly, there are barriers. There are socio-political, understanding of how men and women behave. But this reproduction of sex as taboo and everything is hidden doesn't take into account, the agency of the men and the women. Sometimes, basically, as long as we can see, this reproduction of someone, the Western researcher automatically, systematically doing these researches without any sort of narrative, without any sort of check-in, these biases that they already have, we're not going to, we're not going to move anywhere. And this is the same thing, like this is also current media, and I am mostly concerned with this thing here. Well, with the Why Do They Hate Us? This was written by Mona El-Tahawi, who is supposed to be the radical, feminist activist in the Middle East. And it's a very problematic article. And she reproduces this horrible binary of men, Arab men hating all Arab women, as if, the Middle East is this one thing, as if there aren't, like, more than 20 countries in the Middle East. There are lots of ethnicities, communities within the Middle East. And she just opposes men and women, which is really enough. Like I said in the beginning, there's no such thing as such. There are hierarchies of men, there are hierarchies of women, and there are lots of intersectionality between the two. And the worst thing that she did is that she doesn't focus at all on the normalization of violence, because the very same practices that affect men and women actually reiterate some of the patriarchal practices that we live around. And the time has really come to just, like, bridge this gap, let's say. And this is why gender pedagogy is mostly like desperately required. And actually, when I was doing my fieldwork, I was invited to give a talk by Lebanon Support, and one day I sat, and I was supposed to speak in Arabic, and I was like, yeah, sure, but deep down I was panicking because I had no idea how to say any, even the things that I said now. 2 years since, my discussion, my roundtable discussion, I'm still not capable of speaking, in Arabic, in clear, like, comfortably. So among the recommendations I would like to make, the first one is the most obvious one. Basically, when you are a researcher in the Middle East, please know your limits, please know your position, please know your privilege. Sometimes, depending on your class, your background, you are capable of gaining more knowledge, than others. The brilliant Perla Isa, I don't know where she is, she made it very clear yesterday when she talked about Westerners who just think they are entitled to go into the Palestinian camps, and do their research. And there's a horrible article somewhere about Harvard students, it's on the internet, just Google it, Harvard students, Palestinian camps ethics, and you'll be appalled. And these are people from Harvard. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say was also raised during this conference, pedagogy in the classroom, and this is a twofold thing. First of all, we really, really must work towards flattening the relationship between the teacher and the student. In the Middle East, we grow up with this idea of the teacher as God. I've been in academia for 5 years, and I've only started really to dare to speak to professors, and advanced scholars after 5 years almost, and I consider myself to be a relatively privileged person, who doesn't have to deal with these things on a daily basis. So definitely flattening the hierarchy, but also encouraging students to do it yourself knowledge, focus on narratives, focus on oral history. Even if we're working within the curriculum of the school, we must create an alternative place to allow for the student to speak for themselves. And another thing also is, whatever sort of approach you are doing, whether you're doing international law, whether you are doing psychoanalysis, affect theory, ontological turn, every approach is valid. We need all sorts of things. Because like Eileen said yesterday, if in 100 years there's going to be a change, we must be ready. And we must all be working really in, all along each other's. Just because the Middle East is not that, advanced in certain areas, it doesn't mean that we have to shun certain methodological approaches. And also, we really should work more on including narratives in our research. Like, for example, yesterday, Mr. Emil Shaheen, he told a story to dismantle the myth, between right and left politics. And you could sit in a book and do a lot of these analysis, but for someone who wants to experience this, as a reader, a narrative, an oral history, a personal, story, a sort of reflectivity is really appreciated. And then this concerns all of us as academics. Maybe do some negotiation when we want to publish our work. I am all for open access. We are very lucky now in Lebanon. We have the amazing, amazing, amazing journal, Koh, which is the first gender journal based in Lebanon. So why send every paper to all these established journals, Why reproduce, this corporate hierarchy within academia itself? So definitely open access. And we have the beautiful Jadaliya as well. Anyone here from Jadaliya? Please, definitely. So, and the last thing, but not least, is please leave activists alone. They are often accused of being these Western tokens, and they really have a difficult life, and they have to negotiate as well between their families and friends and everyone else. So please give them a chance, because they are equally in a difficult position, as the rest of us academics. And having said that, thank you very much, and well, that's it.
Thank you, Sabiha. This is the way to start the day. Well, thank you very much. And you also made my job easy by easing us into classroom pedagogy, which is actually part of what Gregory is going to talk about. Gregory teaches media studies at the University of Guelph in Toronto. He has a doctorate in literary studies, and he is a teacher, a writer, and an activist. His presentation today is titled simply, Teaching Media and the Middle East in a Western University. And he's going to take us into his personal experience and challenges, and also tapping into the broader picture of how things are and what are the challenges of classroom pedagogy and breaking the stereotypes in the heads of our students. Thank you, Gregory. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, first of all, to Asfari Institute, the Arab Studies Institute, and to Rania, Hala, and all the other organizers and support staff. Any North American educator seeking to teach students about the injustices done to Palestinians and other peoples of the Middle East, as well as possible remedies for these, faces many obstacles. One is that this pursuit is being undertaken in a context where media coverage of Israel-Palestine is saturated with sympathies for the prerogatives of the Israeli state. A key feature of US-led imperialism in the Middle East is the deep economic and political ties that the ruling classes of the United States and Canada have with Israel, a set of relationships whose dominant ideological reference range from an image of Palestinians as subhumans deserving of at most rights that are contingent upon acquiescence to US-Israeli demands, to, in the absolute best case scenario, a misrepresentation of Israel-Palestine as a conflict in which the two sides have suffered to comparable extents and for which both sides are equally blameworthy. These anti-Palestinian narratives are one component of a larger pattern that Kingelow and Steinberg describe as a hyperreal Orientalism that is circulated across a multitude of news and entertainment platforms and presents a distorted, demonized view of people living in the Middle East. Thus, students enter Canadian and American post-secondary classrooms with almost no reference point, or I should say most students enter North American post-secondary classrooms with almost no reference point for more accurate understandings of the Palestinian situations. So teaching Palestinian rights in a climate where Zionist assumptions prevail faces substantial challenges, but a variety of strategies for attempting to surmount these are available. One is critical pedagogy, a set of teaching methods first articulated by Brazilian scholar Paulo Freire. Hamden and Harris summarize Freire's theories, for those of you who are not familiar, as a view of education as, quote, political activity in which teachers and learners engage in collective praxis, that is, reflection upon a social or political problem, analysis of the conditions which give rise to it, and political action to address it. It is intended to disrupt, to interrupt, and to reimagine social and political relations, to both denounce what is and to announce what might become, end quote. Critical pedagogy is a view, I would add, that sees education as something that should be participatory and dialogic, and should, as Sabiha mentioned, attempt to flatten the hierarchy between teachers and students. The specific form critical pedagogy takes in media studies, the field in which I primarily teach, is what Kellner and Scher call critical media literacy, a pedagogy that focuses on ideology critique, while expanding textual analysis to include issues of social context, control, resistance, and pleasure. Critical media literacy also promotes the production of alternative counter-hegemonic media to enable members of marginalized groups to tell their stories and express their concerns, and to offer members of dominant social formations an opportunity to engage with the social realities that the majority of the world is experiencing. One method that I employ towards these ends is a concept I call activation. Activation involves professors nurturing in students an understanding that hegemonic systems are not trans-historical and that they can be changed through organized opposition. As the name suggests, activation means confronting head-on the ways that capitalism encourages obedience. Activation is therefore a step toward mobilization, one that involves professors and students collaborating to identify dominant ideologies, to understand precisely how they work, and to critique them. Media studies courses are fertile territory for activation in that their core subject is an institution that is central to building consensus for capitalism and imperialism. Classes in this discipline frequently take as central concerns the structure of mass news media and how this shapes the ideological content such outlets disseminate. Media studies professors concerned with the oppression of Palestinians, for example, have an opportunity to facilitate discussions and assign readings that first of all demonstrate to students that Western media coverage is severely biased against Palestinians. This goal can be achieved by including on the reading list writings on this topic, such as selections from Edward Said's body of work, or Falk and Friel's book, Israel and Palestine on Record, which is a study of New York Times misreporting of the Middle East, and many other texts, of course. Media studies professors who care about Palestinians' rights can then demonstrate how mainstream news outlets' hostility towards Palestinians is rooted in such institutional features of news outlets as their profit orientation, their dependence on advertisers, their location in the political and financial web of US-led global capitalism. This goal can be achieved by having students read and discuss works such as Chomsky and Herman's Manufacturing Consent, Ralph Miliband's The State and Capitalist Society, writings by Deepak Kumar and Robert McChesney, and again, many, many others. The aim here is to discuss the specific aims served by the ruling class circulating the perspectives that they do. This necessitates bringing into the classroom discussions of Israel, Palestine, and the media, an analysis that foregrounds how misleading coverage of the issue is part of efforts by elites in the US and allied states to dominate the Middle East. Showing that news outlets consistently favor the positions of the Israeli state and then explaining this phenomenon is a way to undo the lifelong miseducation about Palestine that North American students have received. Students who experience a shift in their own consciousness about the Middle East gain experiential knowledge of how political positions change, which can activate in them a sense that it is possible to persuade others' views to shift and a desire to participate in this process. While it is crucial that teachers who want to nurture student commitments to justice in the Middle East offer critical lenses through which to understand news media, as well as access to dissident opinions about the Palestinian question, particularly perspectives put forth by Palestinians themselves, this aim is unlikely to be realized without educators seeking to address the broader political and economic situation in which our work takes place. Neoliberal capitalism is a barrier to Canadian and American professors concerned with fostering in our students comprehension of Israel-Palestine, in that this phase of capitalism that we're living in generates material and ideological conditions that hamper all forms of campus activism through things like high tuition fees, overworked faculty with insecure employment arrangements. To be clear, by no means am I denying that a great deal of campus activism takes place in Canada and the United States. I should say Anglo-Canada and the United States. My point is that neoliberalism is a constraint on political organizing at post-secondary institutions in Anglo-Canada and the US. One way neoliberalism handcuffs activism is by depoliticizing and inculcating an ethic of individualism in large portions of the society, including among some students. North American professors seeking to engage their students to work for social justice causes such as the Palestinians should therefore attempt wherever possible to enable students to do coursework collectively. In my classes, I often have students conduct group editing of writing assignments. When the students circulate their work, I ask them to focus less on what succeeds or fails in their peers' writing than on a task Peter Elbow sets out. Elbow describes how he asks students to, quote, tell as accurate a story as they can of what actually went on in their minds as they were reading their classmates' work, end quote. Canadian and American students frequently see themselves as in competition with each other. Collective editing work is an attempt to counter the competitiveness neoliberalism demands by fostering an ethos of solidarity. Another strategy for combating neoliberal individualism that I use is to allow students to complete the group assignment required of them by creating an alternative news segment. These can take such forms as short films, documentaries, or podcasts, and then sharing them in class. Students who select this option are asked to produce material dealing with a political issue they think is either underrepresented or misrepresented in mainstream Western news media. During class, they are required to lead a discussion with their peers about their alternative news productions. Rhonda Hammer has students in one of her classes at UCLA conduct a similar exercise, and she contends that it's valuable because, quote, teaching critical media literacy through production constitutes a new form of pedagogy in which students become more aware of how media is constructed, conveys dominant ideologies, and is one of the most powerful, often unconscious sources of education, end quote. This exercise is, as Hammer suggests, a way for students to become conscious of how news media involves making storytelling decisions that inevitably shape the meanings of the narratives being presented. The group alternative news media production assignment gives students an experience of communally working to create counter-hegemonic material, and in this way is a sample, however limited, of collective political activism. It may not be obvious that there is a relationship between issues in the Middle East and activating in North American students a sense of themselves as social beings and not just individuals. The connection is that because, for instance, the dispossession of Palestinians is taking place in the context of neoliberal world order wherein capitalist imperatives underlie the support of the US and Canada for Israel, changing the latter necessarily entails changing the former. I'm just skipping ahead due to time constraints. My analysis and my experiences suggest that North American academics who want to foster student engagement with the Palestinian struggle for self-determination are best served by a multi-pronged approach that includes other extracurricular or outside of the classroom activities that were touched on yesterday, such as supporting campus labor struggles for all workers and fights for lower tuition fees. Media studies professors are well positioned to play a key role in all of this work because our subject allows us to directly and concretely expose students to a different narrative about such issues as Israel-Palestine than that which they typically consume. Such efforts are best served when they are situated within a systemic critique of neoliberal capitalism presented by academics who consistently participate in efforts to organize against that system at multiple interconnected locations. Substantial obstacles exist, but there is no shortage of methods for working towards surmounting them and helping produce a generation of young Americans and Canadians that understands the injustices done to Palestinians and our government's roles in these, and that wishes to aid the cause of Palestinian liberation and indeed liberation struggles elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. Let me just highlight what I got really significant in your paper. For me, regardless of what, where, or who you are teaching, it has become imperative to innovate in creating that shift in consciousness and in generating the critical thinking of our students. I mean, this is borderless, this is universal, this is how every teacher should be doing in class. Thank you, Greg, for your presentation. We move ahead to the third speaker. I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Rabab Abdul Hadi, senior scholar at the Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University, associate professor of Ethnic Studies and Resistance Studies in the College of Ethnic Studies. With a PhD from Yale, Rabab's numerous publications to her credit, along with key activism positions on academic freedom, women's associations, students' unions, and her presentation today has a title that speaks for itself: Resisting the New McCarthyism, Palestine Studies and Justice-Centered Knowledge. The floor is yours, Rabab. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to first start by thanking the Asfari Institute, Fatih Azzam, Rania Al-Masri, and Hala Yanni, and the staff and the translators. It's really great to be back in Beirut, and I have to keep saying that because this is a site, for me, in my mind, continues to be a site of a joint struggle of resistance and steadfastness. And I realize there are contested memories, but I selectively and deliberately choose this memory of Beirut and Lebanon. What I would like to do, I'm going to go through my paper, and I want to historicize the project that we have and end up with some questions. So let me start so I would not go too fast for the translators. In Prison Notebooks, Antonio Gramsci discussed the role of organic intellectuals who would not today restrict their intellectual productivity to the cubicles of the ivory tower, but rather consistently engage in public life in defense of what Frantz Fanon described as the wretched of the earth, despite the cost that such engagement poses to their livelihoods and careers. This is not new nor exceptional. The history of Arab intellectual life is replete with examples, with people who risk their lives and their careers, and a lot of papers have been already presented in the conference. I'm focusing on the US Academy. There, the struggle manifests itself today in at least two fronts. First, the new McCarthyism, a relentless campaign by a well-financed and powerful political machine launched by Israel's lobby and Zionist organizations to silence any voices within the academy who advocate for justice for Palestine in particular, and the papers yesterday spoke about that, and, but also scholars who confront Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, and as we have seen also in the latest attack on ethnic studies, advocates for justice for other marginalized communities who make these claims. The second aspect of it, and it's not unrelated to the first, is the rise of the neoliberal corporate university that prioritizes the interests of wealthy donors over critical inquiry, also has been discussed, and the production of citizenry committed to social justice and social change. This neoliberal corporate educational model camouflages its designs by pretending to protect classical texts in order to chip away at the critical edge of pedagogical praxis that emerged in the 60s, along with perhaps the 60s counter-hegemonic movements. So what I'm doing is I'm historicizing and contextualizing the emergence, development, and challenges phases the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies as a multi-site academic, research, and communal program at San Francisco State University. I want to argue for justice-centered knowledge production, including accountability to the communities whose lived experiences scholars draw on to research, publish, and build flourishing careers. And I end up with some questions about what does it mean if we apply an indivisibility of justice framework. So I want to just give a few examples of what happened to us to contextualize. I don't know if everybody knows, but on November 18, 2013, we were strongly attacked by a group named AMCHA. This is one of the groups that Max in particular spoke about yesterday, very well-financed groups. And one of the things that they targeted was the Edward Said mural. We have a mural, Palestinian cultural mural, named after the late Professor Edward Said. At the mural, there was a literature table by student groups. On it, there was a stencil titled, "Our Heroes Always Killed Colonizers." The stencil was organized by the Student Council for Intertribal Nations, which is the indigenous student group on campus, and they came next to the General Union of Palestinian Students to express solidarity. One of the Palestinian students held the stencil to show that he is in solidarity with the indigenous students. Pictures were taken. This AMCHA attacked us and sent emails to the president of the university, arguing that since Edward Said called Israel a colonial state, and since this is Edward Said mural, and since the stencil calls for he hails the heroes that always killed colonizers, ergo, the General Union of Palestinian Students is calling for the murder of Jews, and the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas, we were initiative at the time, is engaging in the teaching of the murder of Jews. These attacks happen all the time. They're not new. But what's interesting is that the next day, the university president's office came out with a statement condemning anti-Semitism. In effect, confirming that what we were engaged in was anti-Semitic activities rather than stopping to think about what was going on. The attack escalated further after we went to Palestine in 2014 an academic and labor delegation, and especially after an event during which we reported and we talked about that this delegation was not Solidarity 101, that we were engaging in, we wanted to build relations with Palestinian universities and so on. And they claimed that we created a hostile environment for Jewish students on campus. We had actually videotaped our event. They doctored the audio. We videotaped our event. We put it on the university archives. But the events, the attack continues. And then they requested something called public record, which is allowed in the state of California, through which they can seize the records of specifically my own travel. They're claiming that I misused university funds to go to Palestine rather than engage in academic activities, because going to Palestine is not academic activity, obviously. And accusing me of implications with terrorism and trying to get me fired. But why is that happen? And I think this is really important to think about that. It's not personal. I don't know these people. It's not an isolated act, and it's not accidental, and it's not random. This has to do with several histories. The history of the university itself as a place where students advocate for Palestine, but the university is very hostile, not only to Palestine, to a lot of other issues. The past president has publicly participated with the Israeli lobby willingly. He was not duped into that. In 2002, Palestinian students were sanctioned during the Aqsa Intifada. A task force was formed in which has recommended that a faculty get hired in order to mentor students and so on, because we do not have. We have 900 faculty members, there's just me. And at that time, Palestinian students were engaged, again, with the Student Council for Intertribal Nations, the Native American Student Organization. And the Native American Student Organization were going to do a mural commemorating the struggle of Native people. So they told the Palestinian students, why don't you do a Palestinian mural? Palestinian students said, good idea. Wasn't a good idea. Palestinian students started working on the Palestinian mural, and all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. I want to just show some two images of the original mural rendering and the end, what happened. Once the Palestinian mural, yeah, this one. This is the Palestinian mural, and this is not the official one. As you can see, this is they brought two artists, an anti-Zionist Jewish artist who painted actually on the inside of walls of Al-Funun al-Sha'biyya, which is a Palestinian art center, inside the walls, because during the occupation, Palestinians couldn't paint outside, and a Palestinian artist, Faik Awais. And if you look near Edward Said's head, there is the little figure of Handala, the cartoon character by Najil Ali. He is carrying in one hand a pen, which is symbolizes Ghassan Kanafani's words, Al-Kalima al-Bunduqiyya, my word is my gun. And in the other hand, he's carrying a key, which symbolizes the Palestinian displacement, and on it written Al-Awda, return. What happened is that all hell broke loose. All the Zionist organizations came, and we have a very big group in San Francisco called Jewish Community Relations Council, JCRC. They protested, and they said that the whole mural is anti-Semitic, it provokes a hostile climate for Jewish students, and so on. But specifically, they were not really smart enough because they only latched onto Handala. They did not protest all of the other symbols. And so, but as a result of that, the president placed a moratorium on the mural for 5 years. So what ended up happening, the end result is that the Native American mural, which is supposed to be the first, was actually the last one to happen. And the Palestinian mural, if I can just get the next image, please. No, not, yeah. The Palestinian mural, you can see Handala is gone. And in his place, there is cactus. And this is like, we ended up negotiating with the president of the university. But on the day of the unveiling of the mural, all the Palestinian kids came wearing T-shirts with Handala on it. And so this is one of the things that is really important to emphasize, is that even though they disappeared, Handala, from the mural, actually it becomes part of the oral history narrative that and we can talk about that further. But this took from 2000 all the way until 2007 when we had the mural. In the process, there have been much more attacks, Islamophobic attacks, attacks in 2008, 2009 that support Palestine, condemn Hamas, and they have shoes thrown at the Shahadatayn. Yani. There was a lot of stuff going on. And then the Palestinian, again, they had a program for the mural, the Palestinian students, and in the process of it, the president of the university ended up canceling the searches for our faculty lines, and then he completely deleted them from the budget. So now, we come today to 2013 when the attack happened by the Amkha group, where we have one faculty member, myself, no budget, no other faculty, no staff, one program. So this is why I'm saying this is not accidental, it's not random, it's not personal. What was going on is we had a new university president who was much more open to talking with Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian communities. He came to the Arab Cultural Community Center. He's a person of color. He's a corporate person. So there is the other structural issue that is fighting against us. So they wanted to instill the chilling factor in his heart. Don't go and don't collaborate with the community. But I think more importantly, we were on the verge of doing three things. Oh my God. Ooh, okay. We were on the verge of accomplishing three things. We were on the verge of having a memorandum of agreement with Al-Najah National University in Palestine, which they call terrorist universities. We were about to get the Edward Said Scholarship, which the mural is enough, we have a Palestine course, too much going on. And more importantly, we were on the verge of passing an academic minor in Arab and Muslim ethnicity and diaspora studies that had courses like Palestine, had a course like colonialism, imperialism, and resistance, Islamophobia, all the courses that we think are really important to learn, but they did not think so. And our courses, we were actually trying to get them all considered GE, general elective courses, which means students all throughout the university can take them. So the attack, we believe, was actually an attempt to stunt any kind of institutionalization of the program. If you get rid of the only faculty member, it's going to take a very long time to try to build a program and so on. So this is part of the struggle we're going on. The other thing that I'm going to go very briefly, but I think it's really important, is to think about, even though I am going to talk, I will mention the curriculum a little bit, if I can take maybe, I'll talk about the history, because I think it's very much part of the US history, and if we don't think about US history, we chop up things. We only think about the attack on these programs as exceptional, as something separate and isolated, but it's not. This is part of the history of the United States. We're talking about a settler colonial state that started in 1492 when somebody got lost trying to build greed for another empire. It's built on the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans. It's built on manifest destiny. It's built on the exclusion. And historically, and we need to remember that every time the United States has embarked on a new imperialist intervention, it always intensified its surveillance and oppression and stifling of voices in the US. And this goes from the Palmer raids, and we can expand on that, the detention of anarchists such as Emma Goldman, the rise of anti-communism, McCarthyism, the incarceration of 110,000 Japanese in concentration camps during the Second World War, the 60s, the COINTELPRO, and the targeting of anti-war activists. And then we come closer to the attacks against, not only after 9/11, 2001, but there was a very famous case of the LA8 case, which we can actually expand on, but which brings all the various places together, that was specifically targeting pro-Palestinian activism. Oh, okay, slow down. Pro-Palestinian activism in Los Angeles, and it actually only got settled in 2007. This was from 1986 to 2007. And if we can continue like going through, we know the prosecution of Sami al-Aryan, the case of Rasmiya Ode continues, and so on and so forth. I don't even have time, but I wanted to kind of like make sure that we're contextualizing this. This is part of a history. This is not something exceptional. This is not something separate from anything else. And I'm not going to talk about the history of the region on Vietnam and so on. So how do we respond? How do we respond to that? People could choose different things. We decided, A, to go publicly with it, make it transparent, take it out of the corridors of the secretness of the pro-Israeli lobby that is always trying to kind of arm twist people and so on, to call on allies and to out the question of funding. We have the Zionist groups donate to the university millions of dollars. We now have a very strong department of Jewish studies historically, but now we have Israeli studies that was given to the university endowed chair right after we started our program in 2007, within 2009. And the person who occupies the Israeli chair is actually a person who wrote his thesis, a big admirer of Menachem Begin, and a person who served in the Israeli military. And during the attack on us, the Jewish studies and the Israeli studies were writing to the president saying that they were afraid for their security from us. When we have people who have served in the military, in the fourth strongest military in the world, walking around campus. The other thing that was most important is building with allies. And I'm going to skip now to kind of like just say what are two things about the program itself that we kind of like when we are thinking about how the program came about. As I mentioned, it was a long, protracted community struggle on and off campus, at the center of which is justice-centered activism, justice-centered knowledge production. But we do critique of area studies, so we don't use the terms Middle East or Near East, middle of the East to whom. And we are actually very critical of assimilationist tendencies and domesticated tendencies within Arab and Muslim American studies. And we also account for multiple structural inequalities. So we don't start by talking about Arabs and Muslims, and then we end up after a few years down the line contesting and doing counter-hegemonic narratives. Actually, from the get-go, we're incorporated. So I would just want to like say our minor is included of two primary courses, Introduction to Arab and Muslim Communities, and another course around the civil liberties of Arabs and Muslims post 9/11/2001, but we go back and we connect with other communities. And then there are three different sections from which students can select. One is about mapping Arab diasporas, which involves oral history and archival research. The second one is mapping Muslim ethnicities and contesting Islamophobia. And the third one is gender and sexuality studies in the global South, focusing on Arab and Muslim communities. So rather than talk about Arabs and Muslims as generic bodies, we're actually bringing the whole question of critique of racism, critique of settler colonialism, and critique of Islamophobia and the various tendencies tendencies. So inside the classroom and outside the classrooms, students are constantly engaging with the knowledge. They read Gramsci and they read Edward Said and they read all the texts that Wretched of the Earth, they read all of and they read the classics as well. So we critique also the classics. So we read Thomas Friedman and Huntington, we read all of that. And we also read other contestations, but we also, because we don't have resources, we also couple up resources. So for instance, rather than just do straightforward classrooms, we engage in something called open classrooms. So every 2-3 weeks, we actually open the classroom to the community. The students and the faculty together come together to organize events around the topic of the class. We show videos that the students edit and cut down, like some of them are really long. The Battle of Algiers is 2 hours. It's too long. They'll edit down and they'll explain what is it that they erased, edited down in their presentation. So the students are actually engaging in the actual teaching of the class. In fact, community attends, people from outside of the university attend. They come and they engage and we give the syllabus and people read and sometimes they suggest additional readings. We actually put together panels of community speakers who come and panels of scholars who come together, and every single time we always have scholars and community activists. So kind of like not making this hierarchical knowledge production in which the people who have the PhDs are seen as the experts because they have they're part of the credentialist society where they have the certification that we have knowledge, but we actually have the community organizers. So I will just mention a couple of examples. Last semester we had, okay, just, if I can just, 1 minute, okay. We had an event on 1492 and I can explain about that more. We had a collaboration with the Arab Film Festival. We wrote the film, The Wanted 18, and we did a panel discussion critique of that. We had an event with the Asian American community around the Japanese Day of Remembrance, where we showed the film by the Japanese director of a Palestinian who was incarcerated after 9/11/2001. And we had activists from the Japanese community who were incarcerated in the concentration camps come and speak about what does it mean to have oral histories and how the oral histories of the Japanese community actually enabled them to get the apology from the US government for the concentration camps. Just and I can talk about more events later on, but I just wanted to kind of like, the things are really, really important is that we do not treat students as consumers and we refuse to consider ourselves customer service. So if they are not happy about that, that is fine, but so we are really, it's a very rigorous project. We did succeed in having the agreement with Al-Najah. We did succeed in having the Edward Said Scholarship. We have 25 courses, every single one of them is GE. So we have students from all over the university. We cannot keep them out of our classroom. And we are very much accountable to the community and we are very much connected with the community. We meet, we debrief, we discuss. So I have a couple of questions. Just to end, okay. In my mind, I was thinking about this because I assume that it is knowledge, but is the academy a site for justice-centered knowledge productive more so than outside the academy? Okay, I don't think so, but I think that we are in the academy already. So I don't think we need to apologize for being in the academy, but we need to make of it what we can, because whether we do or we do not, we're complicit. We are complicit in reproducing the status quo. So we need to choose whether we are going to continue furthering injustice or we are going to engage in disrupting. So my paper basically is a call for intellectual incitement and praxis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abab. I think what I have felt familiar with is the continuous attempt not to focus on generic bodies, but to go to the broader, to focus on the criticism itself, on the deconstruction itself, and on the, again, as we said, the building up of critical thinking in our students. Thank you very much for your presentation. And thank all the panelists also. We will have 20 minutes to have the floor open for you for any questions or very quick comments to engage our panelists and what has been said. So the floor is yours. Any questions? Yes, please.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, I'm Minnatullah Hindawi, in case you don't know. I would like to ask Sabiha. I completely agree with you that that we really need to flatten the relationship between the professor and the students. And I personally think that there are two maybe approaches that still need experimentation if it can happen in Arab societies or not. And I would like to see if you think of other approaches to also reach this flat relationship. So my two suggestions, the first one is to reduce the titles in the university. So by actually eliminating the titles and just by calling everyone by his name. In Egypt, for example, we really have to say a professor or a doctor or whatever. And my second suggestion is to really have a monitoring and assessment system for the professors. So do you think if this is applicable or not? Thank you.
Another question? We'll take 3 questions and then we'll give floor for answers. No? Yes, please, go ahead.
راح أحكي بالعربي. تفضل. هلا العنوان هو السؤال للصبيحة نحو بحوث نسوية متحررة من إرث الاستعمار. بصراحة من العرض ما وضح بالنسبة لي أي استعمار تقصدين. هل هي الحقبة اللي مرت فيها دول عربية خلال فترة من الفترات، هي الفترة القصيرة، أم قصدك بالاستعمار هو شيء تاني؟ شكرا.
شكرا. أستاذ. Did you have a question, sir? Did you have a question? Yes.
It wasn't so much a question. I just wanted to comment on the idea of levelling and the apparent, or the appearance at least in British universities. A lot of international students say, oh, there's equality between teachers and students and the hierarchy doesn't exist. But I think a lot of this is actually a bit of a myth. Universities, the neoliberal university is very much presented as a place where students come in as customers, they buy a degree, and they're used to that relationship, and the customer's always right. But of course, what students discover is that the customer isn't always right, and they may be on first name terms with their professors, etc. But actually, when it comes to asking for extensions, getting grades, etc., a lot of students are shocked by the fact that the power relationship, which isn't apparent, is in fact very real. So just maybe you could comment on that.
Okay, Sabih, would you like to answer, please?
I'll start with the second question, if that's okay. بعتقد فيني احكي بالعربي بهيدي. Yeah, بس الفكرة من كل اللي قلته إنه الاستعمار منه شغلة فينا ندقرها ما إنه أوكي حنقول على الإنجليزي sorry إنه الاستعمار is not limited to physical violence في عنده بيترك أكبر خطر عنده إنه بيترك فكرة إنه كل شيء غربي هو أقوى وأكثر more scientific و rational من المحلي. This is very very problematic لأنه مثلا بهالكونفرنس أوكي مثلا في مرة كنا عم نحكي عن citizenship أو consent أو hegemony ما بتذكر امبارح مدري أولت امبارح حدا حكى عن لوك حدا حكى عن جرامشي حدا حكى عن ماركس أوكي wonderful thinkers بس كمان there are feminist scholars يلي طلعوا شو يعني individuality بالميدل ايست يلي ما لها علاقه بالويسترن understandings شو الcitizenship بالميدل ايست يلي كمان ما لها علاقه ليه basically I want people to critique الكوريكولوم in the classroom الاشياء اللي ربينا فيها بالمدرسه والجامعه فاستعمار / استبداد مثل ما قال السكولر يلي حكينا معه بالسكايب بس ما كان مسموع منيح. وكرمال منة الله actually you were one of the recommendations but I was running out of time when you said critique your curriculum like you looked at it and you were like there's something not quite right here so you did that but also about your monitoring of professors and this is a question particularly to anyone in Lebanon who works or knows the system of the Lebanese university, because it is my impression that because the professor is a civil servant, you get appointed, you get paid your salary every month, there's almost no incentive to publish, to keep up to date, to produce quality research, because you don't care. You're going to get your salary anyway, and no one is going to remove you from your position. And this reiterates this whole hierarchy of, I'm the teacher, you know, and you're the student, and there's nothing you can do about it. But I believe that we can do something about it, you know, like crafting this alternative space in the classroom, you know, by storytellings or coming up with radical, you know, things like, what was it, the open classroom? Or, you know, dismantling the whole myth of neoliberal individualism by showing people that actually we are all more connected than what we think.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think the two questions, there's two comments connect with each other, whether what sort of a hierarchy you have. Do you have a hierarchy? Do you not have a hierarchy? What do you strive for? I think that definitely there is power, but we are facing the model that the customer is always right. We are constantly pressured to actually give better grades, whether students are doing well or not. And in the political aspect of it, there is also the threat that when you are having curriculum under attack, because we are doing, you know, there is the whole liberal thing of we want value-free knowledge, right? So there is that. On top of that, so we have ethnic studies under attack, for sure. But on top of that, we are also made to be seen as the ones who are creating a hostile environment for Jewish students in the classroom. And this is the most recent attack, as yesterday the panel actually elaborated on that a lot. So it becomes even additionally more so. In the absence of other courses in the university and in the absence of students being prepared when they come to our classrooms to find what we are, the normative, quote-unquote normative knowledge, not something completely out of the ordinary. Everything we talk about becomes contested. Online classes even become even harder than classroom class in person. For instance, I just want to you know, what you're talking about, Sabiha. I teach a course called Gender and Modernity in Arab and Muslim Communities. I've decided I'm never going to teach that course online, because from the beginning to the end, students continue spewing Orientalist and racist and colonialist ventures throughout. And the United States is so much better off than the rest of the world, and I'm so lucky to be in the US, and it doesn't matter how much statistics you give them, it doesn't matter whether you tell them to read Edward Said, it doesn't matter whether you explain it doesn't matter to give them videos if they don't want to read, so they can watch on YouTube or something. I mean, there is a lot of exercises too. They continue doing that. Now, since we've been attacked, I've actually become much more sensitive to what students, I didn't really, well, you know, I'm going to say whatever I want and I want to teach them, but at the same time in the classroom, I always feel that I am being watched. I'm always feeling I'm being watched, and somebody is always going to go meet with the dean and say, what is this? How come she puts this stuff on the curriculum? I said, well, you don't have to take my classroom. It's elective. You can drop it and go take another classroom. But there is the pressure all the time, because then there is also the evaluation that are multiple choice, that don't have quality in it, and students are programmed to become consumers. I mean, not only consumers in terms of customer service, but also consumers of knowledge, in the sense that they do not want to engage in critical thinking. And especially in the United States, the academic, the educational system produces docile citizens. I mean, that's the whole purpose of it. We know that. So then they come, they don't want to think, they don't want to edit. They don't want to write essays. They don't want to write journals. They would like to have an exam at the end of the semester. And I say, I don't give exams. I'm sorry, and if I give you exams, it's going to be open book. Cheat all you want, because if you don't know the material, I don't care. Bring it back whenever you want to work with each other. Students are not used to doing that, because they want to know what the professor tells them. This is what, and so what exactly do you think? And I say, well, you can Google me, I know what I think, but I want you to critique, become more critical, think about it. And it's very hard to deal with that. In the absence of preparatory material already, they don't come predisposed to understanding and learning, which is different when you talk in the, like I know in Arabic, in the universities in Arabic, Birzet, I've taught at Birzet, at AUC, it's different than in the US, because they're not prepared. And on top of it, there is this thing that already you know that is threatening you. So a lot of the times you are pushed to actually deal with consumers, and they are very aware. A lot of the students who are consumers are very aware that they are consumers. And they say, I'm not very happy. What do I need to do to get the A? And I say, look at this, you have to work throughout the semester. You cannot be doing it one-shot deal. You have to come to class. But they will go and complain, and there is a pressure to graduate. You have to graduate, whether students learn or they don't learn. But there is also an additional socioeconomic pressure, because our students have 3 jobs. Our students are in a public university. Our students have tons of loans on them, and the university is trying to recruit students who come from wealthy areas, from Southern California, from San Diego, where is there a military base, who are cut off from their community, because San Francisco Bay Area is, people are connected with their communities. So when you start recruiting people from there, you put them in the dorms. The Greek scene is very prevalent now. Students used to chalk on the ground and write protests and so on. But now people are in sororities and fraternities, partying Friday and Saturday. I'm not against having everybody should have a good time, especially young people. But they're trying to deplete it all in the presence of the attack on ethnic studies, in the attack on the labor, on the professors and so on. There is this kind of and the pressure to do fundraising in a public university, not in a private university. So it is definitely there, but it's empowering students who are consumers, rather than the other way around.
Thank you. Gregory, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just briefly on the issue of flattening hierarchy. I would add, first of all, that I do think that in the neoliberal context, as I think Rabab was suggesting, there are risks associated with that, as much as I am also simultaneously endorsing efforts to flatten hierarchy between teachers and students, particularly those of us who, like myself, are teaching on short-term contracts without being in tenure-track positions. We really are, I think, under pressure to satisfy the customer/student. So there are risks associated, in a sense, with devolving the limited power that we have. At the same time, though, I do think that in a broader political sense, evening out the hierarchy between student and professors within the classroom is an objective worth pursuing. And I agree with Mike's comment about the limitations that exist to that, as far as the fact that at the end of the day, we grade them and we determine, if they can have an extension and so on, as you said. At the same time, I think I would just note that there are some strategies that we can employ for reallocating power within the classroom. So things like offering students an opportunity to participate in negotiating the curriculum. So giving them some degree of democratic control over, for example, what assignments they'll undertake to determine their grade. Another method for, I think, flattening out hierarchy, just to make it concrete and not a theoretical concept, would be to give students some role in grading each other, perhaps even themselves, though I can't say I've tried that one. I think that is another, concrete way that we can attempt to redistribute some of the power in the classroom, despite the risks associated with that in the neoliberal context.
Thank you. I guess we have time for one more question, Rania.
I just want to add one more suggestion and one more challenge to the concept of redistributing the hierarchy within the classroom and producing producing, sorry for my language, encouraging more empowerment amongst the students. One strategy that I've employed for 8 years and that has worked is that students get to individually determine their evaluation methods. So not as a class, but each student can meet with me one-on-one and come up with, this is how I myself would like to be evaluated. And they would have to do that within the first 4 weeks of the semester. It's extremely exhausting for professors, but it aims to build a sense of responsibility for the student. The challenge, however, is within graduate seminars and senior undergraduate seminars, when we try, or let me personalize this, when I have tried to encourage students to take ownership of the curriculum, to take ownership of the learning process, it has been extraordinarily difficult. Because I think we're asking now too much of students who walk into one classroom and find the model of learning and teaching and collective engagement very different than what they are typically used to, which is the regurgitation and banking model. And so then they don't know how to understand critical thinking, they don't know how to experience it, they don't know how to develop it. So I think if we really want to be successful, we're going to need to think on a broader curriculum basis rather than on a one class by class basis. And what would be optimal, and this is why this panel is beautiful coming right before the next panel, is to be able to engage that with high schools and to be able to engage that with middle schools and elementary schools, because we need to be training our students at a much younger age to actually be critical thinkers rather than simply regurgitators of information.
Yes,
I think
please.
what Rania is saying is very important. I mean, the role of schools, and in particular, I mean, secondary, primary, and so on, but the role of schools of education. For example, in Lebanon, the critical pedagogy is not taught. Basically, is not. I mean, like students are not trained. I mean, I'm sure I know Balamand, LAU. I mean, could be some professors who introduce the concept in one of the courses. But I'm saying, as an experience, is they're not trained to go teach there in that domain. So, which means that all those trained teachers end up, going back to the banking system. The problem is, for example, I teach a course. I was telling some colleagues informally. I teach a course now on informal education. The fact that to introduce it was a big deal, to see the value of informal education. Yeah, but they'll work in what? And then I had to justify it because of this neoliberal system, because of the market. The number of Syrian refugees now, the need for it in the area. So that's for the administration. But then the colleagues who think that there's a problem with protection. So if we go to refugee camps or so-called poor neighborhoods, that the students might not be safe, their parents might not allow them. You discover, I think, very similar, I don't know if Rami is not here, but I mean, like American University of Cairo now. Balamand is also on a hill, so it's far away from the city. It's far away, but it's just 10 minutes by car. But for the students who live on campus, they just avoid. Some of them, they say, it's the first time. We didn't know that we had these neighborhoods in the... But the thing is, it's very difficult, and you need really to change not just the curriculum, but also the vision and the approach of schools of education. And I'm so unfortunate that even now, today, since we're dealing with academia and social justice, you don't have people from the School of Education participating or in this discussion. So maybe we should work on this as well. That's
for the next conference.
Yeah, maybe.
Thank you. Eileen, last comment.
Thank you. Rabab, at this stage in our life, and with the severe challenges and represented by the ideological, structural, and political, what are the strategies that you employ to ensure continuity, really? Are there any coordinating bodies among the universities of academic activists for building feasible strategies? Because, sometimes we feel that, some charismatic figures, when they disappear, continuity is abolished. So how can we, ensure continuity? I think this is an important question to ask. Gregory, how can we do, or how can we make the alternative a norm? How can we widen the spaces for alternative knowledge and alternative critique and all that? Because in our context, the Institute of Women's Studies is only doing critique. So it is becoming a norm. And I think, there are some strategies, even when you go to employment and reproducing, your staff and your cadre. You maintain the same pedagogy and at the same time, the same kind of activism. So alternative for us in the first Intifada was popular education, the Freire. But I feel that, it is the stage where alternatives should become the norm. So how do we do that in structures that are, very conservative? And sexuality we don't talk about sexuality in Palestine, even in the Institute of Women's Studies. But lately we thought that how can we do feminist studies and women's studies without any courses on sexuality? So how can we do that in the Arab Middle East studies, in the women's studies in the Middle East? How to approach this? Because when you talk about sexuality, it's then the Western feminism and, the traditional community would be attacking you. So that's a puzzle for us, really, how to approach sexuality, because it's easier, outside the Middle East. So if you have any suggestions, thanks.
Thank you, Eileen. I guess to answer this, we need another panel, but I'll take another question, and then I'll give each of the speakers 1 minute to conclude, please. Go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I actually just have a comment in reaction to the discussion about flattening out hierarchies of power in the classroom. I was thinking about a American feminist science fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin, wrote a book called The Dispossessed, where she writes about kind of a post-revolutionary possible utopia. And so what they do for pedagogy is that, people just come together, professor and students, and if they like the class, then the teaching is whatever the students request from the teacher and whatever the teacher wants to teach the students, and they just come at it by consensus. And then I was thinking about mechanisms for implementing that in the US university, and at first I was like, well, we would kind of need a revolution. But that's kind of just my instinct for all things. But then I realized that actually, and Cornell might be relatively privileged in this, but there are mechanisms for such things. I mean, there's independent study modules in a great deal of universities. And professors are willing to teach them, and the problem is that most students don't want to do them. And even graduate students, where you can say we're purportedly encouraged to be creative, we don't necessarily engage or take advantage sufficiently of these mechanisms. And because graduate students don't do it enough, then everyone leans back on the regular curriculum, which then takes up all the time. So of course, it's always a chicken and egg problem, but it's interesting to note that these mechanisms do exist. It's the fact that there isn't a concerted decision from faculty and students to use these mechanisms, and that's something we're thinking through, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's take a minute for each one to conclude on comments and what has been said. Sabiha, would you like to?
First, there was a question about alternative spaces, and I'm not going to say I'm very, very optimistic, but I believe that technology and the use of visuals for a new generation is very, very relevant. Actually, I'm convinced in 10 years, like even PhD thesis will be like half of it written and the rest will be like some sort of a documentary or, like among this. But also I think, or that's the impression I got from the students in the UK, tuition fees are so expensive, they actually come to the university quite prepared. Like I felt for 18 years old, you know, like 101 anthropology, they just knew all these books and authors. You don't just pay all this money, go in there, you know. So I don't know, maybe I'm just saying it as, you know, like hoping desperately to do, you know, to believe. Maybe it's a sort of make-believe, I don't know. But to answer the question on sexuality, I think what we can do, obviously you cannot just go from shame and honor to queer and different ways, you know, of being, you know, of being gay or queer or homosexual, you know, whether you're flamboyant, whether you look like a normal, you know, heteronormative man, it's all these things. But what we can do is critique, for example, the honor-shame binary. Why is it always that women bring shame and the men are honorable, you know? There are instances of very shameful instances within, you know, the men binary, and there are honorable things, you know, also in the women. But let us also think about how it changes over time. Political economy, you know, women went out to work. It didn't translate into emancipation. But when women go out to work, something happens in their consciousness. And we should start using these words. Consciousness, emotions, you know, like anger. These things are this is the lived experience. And this is why, again, epistemic violence, colonial, you know, all this stuff, there's no such thing as mind and body. I see the body from the feminist perspective, because as a woman, we are subjected to society. Our body writes society, and society is written on our body. So there's no such thing as being rational and using numbers and statistics. But we can critique all these binaries, even if it takes 100 years, like you said.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay, so I guess the first thing I would just underscore on, I'll go from the depressed to the optimistic. The bleaker point is what I would say in response to Rania's comment about each student determining how they're evaluated, which I think is, you know, an extremely exciting idea. But it reminds me, as do a lot of the things that I myself have been advocating, of just how much of how significant are the constraints that we are faced, many of us who teach extremely large classes and who have to take on as much, if we're on a contract basis, teach as many classes as we can possibly get our hands on in order to survive. All of those undermine our capacity, in my view, to teach effectively, and by effectively I really mean to teach critical pedagogy, to teach forms of emancipatory education. It's frankly a lot easier to just say, okay, here's a multiple choice, you know, exam or something, than to go through some, you know, multi-stage editing process. It's easier to not meet with every student and to talk with them about how they would like to be evaluated. So I guess I would reiterate a lot of what was said in the past couple of days already about how these there's a really strong link between the need to improve and defend the conditions of academic labor and of student work, because students are also, I would add, much less, in a much harder position to become critically conscious when they have to work 30 hours a week part-time or something in order to minimize their debt load because of high tuition. So what I'm saying here is that, yeah, I really want to underscore how important that link is between defending and improving our labor conditions and the conditions of in which students undertake their education. Because I don't think that any kind of emancipatory education can thrive when it's being stifled materially through these sorts of neoliberal education policies. as to the question of how we can make the alternative the norm, how we can widen the space, I mean, yeah, I strongly agree, as I was trying to suggest yesterday in the town hall, that the goal should be not just to, you know, offer a different perspective, but to try to build counter-hegemonies, and that we should be, frankly, shameless about that. Of course, this is an incredibly tall order. I mean, I think that, again, to hit on the issue of organization, I mean, I think it's just crucial to build new organizations for pursuing these tasks, to strengthen and change, because the existing, you know, unions and other associations that exist, because they are often very deeply flawed, and deepen relations between the various types of academic unions, but also foster stronger or even just give birth to, for the first time in some cases, relations between academic locals and unions in sectors that are really not related to academic work, but based in the same community. So I think breaking out of that sectionalism is really crucial to widening the space for critical pedagogy and for counter-hegemony. And intimately related to that would be that it is necessary, I think, to extend pedagogical activity beyond the classroom to the greatest extent possible. I think during Rafif's presentation yesterday, she mentioned how Israeli apartheid weeks, and I would add also BDS initiatives, are very much pedagogical. They're centered around talks and documentary films and things of this nature. So I think it's necessary to view this as part and parcel of the education that goes on in the classroom. And there are,
Just very quickly.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, as I guess Max was suggesting, there are possibilities that exist for this already, and we see this in the form of community and campus organizations that have workshops and that attempt to bring some of the knowledge production that goes on within the university beyond the walls of the university. And so I think the more that academics with justice commitments can participate in those kinds of things, the better.
Thank you again.
Okay. Will be very quick. I will try. Okay. So I want to actually start from the last question about sexuality and just give an example, because I have been involved along with colleagues from Birzeit with Al-Qaws for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society in actually trying to come up with an anti-colonial discourse on sexuality for Palestinian society in Arabic. And people say, why in Arabic? It's not exceptional, but because it's much easier to speak in other languages than to speak about it in Arabic. And I mean, you know, because we don't speak about it, then there is the whole colonial discourse that's so saturated and clouds and clogs everything we're thinking about, so it becomes really difficult. And I think I think we really need to revisit the whole question around gender too, because we're still dealing with a lot of this stuff. So I think that's really exciting way to talk about it. And of course, in our collaboration, I think we can talk about that more. I want to kind of like just talk about the whole question of continuity. And this is really the thing that obsesses me, because I do know that the idea of us, when I went to San Francisco State, we were supposed to be 3 faculty members. That's my contract. My contract was 3 faculty members. The previous president canceled the searches, deleted the lines, and then it has been, since it had then no budget, not even for printing syllabi. And so basically it's starvation. It's kind of like, the message is, do you want to continue doing this? This is what it means. full course, so full load. So it becomes really harder. It's a huge challenge to do that. And this is, so what we are really trying to do is we have a big community. And when I say community of justice, it's not just Arabs and Muslims. We have Japanese, and we have anti-Zionist Jews, and we have African Americans, and we have women and men, and we have queers and straight. We have all sorts of people really are very much part of this program that are advocating also with us. Advocating with the president of the university. The problem is because it's always about money. At the end of the day, they say this is wonderful what you're doing. The students are very happy, but there is the money that is being donated by Zionist groups. I mean, millions and millions and millions. And we can't compete in the age of corporate university, which brings me to the question that Rania, you're asking. I actually, one of my biggest nightmares is to be in a liberal art college in the Northeast where you don't grade. You have to write all these, again, evaluation. And what happens is that it has entitled students. It has students who are already come with the cultural capital, with the social capital, with the political, with the educational capital. And they really treat the professors are their servants. I mean, servants or slaves, because they feel so entitled to it. So I think in order for us to be able to do very critical pedagogy, it requires collective will. Because if I'm going to be doing it and other professors are not doing it, I mean, the students come and tell me, the Israeli studies professor, he's very easy, gives easy A's, tells the students, you have 3 questions to answer on the exam. Here they are. If you don't like it, make up your own exam. So, I mean, and I say, I'm sorry, I cannot pass you in Palestine course if you do not know. I'm not going to do that. But this is the kind of stuff we're working with. And this is an extreme case, but you also, our own colleagues, when you are teaching full load, when you are contingent faculty, when there are labor issues, with the students too. I mean, the students also, when they have 3-4 jobs, when are they going to have the time to kind of sit down and engage and get peer review with each other and so on? So it really requires structural. We really need to push for the structural changes in the universities in order for us to have much more equitable socio-economic, political economic relations. The last thing is I wanted to, I think, and I think the advocacy. I think it's really kind of like coming together. We do have something that is not normative. That's alternative. The ethnic studies, ethnic studies, gender and sexuality, women's studies, labor studies, all these, they are altered and they've moved to the mainstream. But what happens is that what we've accomplished in the 60s, they're rolling back. Because the rise of the corporate university, they're going to it's going to continue being back and forth. So the question of building movements within and outside of the academy, always been connected with social movements, not just doing something within the academy. We keep pushing for that, and these models work, but they require too much work. So it really requires much more, and we are going to continue being attacked because the corporate university is not interested in the stuff that we're doing, because the stuff that we're doing defeats the project of producing docile citizens. It's not in their interest, so.
Thank you. I guess we'll end it here. We already took a few minutes from your break. Rania, till what time? Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Thanks for the panelists. It was a pleasure to be chairing, moderating this.
Yes, we still would like you to be back here at 11:30.